There are certain texts throughout history that people whisper about quietly, not because they were evil, but because they were believed to carry unusual psychological and spiritual power. And according to ancient stories, there was one particular psalm that some people believed was intentionally ignored, hidden, or rarely discussed openly because of the effect it supposedly had on the human mind, especially concerning wealth, discipline, and personal authority. Now, whether every story surrounding it is historically accurate is not the point, because what made this psalm fascinating was not superstition. It was a message inside it, a message so direct, so psychologically powerful, that many people today would feel uncomfortable hearing it repeatedly, because the psalm did not speak like modern motivational advice. It spoke with certainty, authority, expectation, responsibility, and according to ancient belief, repeatedly speaking those words changed the internal condition of the person reciting them. That's where the fear came from. Not magic, conditioning. Most people live in emotional survival mode constantly. Fear, stress, comparison, anxiety, mental exhaustion, and over time, those emotional states shape behavior. A fearful person behaves differently from a calm person. A hopeless mind makes different decisions from a confident one. That affects discipline, patience, risk tolerance, consistency, financial judgment, which means internal condition eventually affects external outcomes. Ancient traditions understood this deeply. That's why sacred texts were often repeated aloud daily, not because repetition magically changed reality overnight, but because repetition slowly changed the person repeating the words. Think carefully about this. Every human being already repeats internal sentences constantly. I'm unlucky. Nothing works for me. I'll always struggle. I'm behind in life. Money disappears too fast. Most people do this unconsciously, and repeated thoughts eventually become emotional beliefs. Beliefs influence behavior. Behavior shapes outcomes. That's why ancient people guarded language carefully, because repeated words influence identity over time. This particular psalm was believed to be powerful because it did not speak from weakness. It spoke from alignment. It described abundance, stability, confidence, protection, flourishing, favor, not desperation. And according to ancient teachers, a person who repeatedly immersed themselves in those ideas slowly stopped thinking like a fearful person. That changes behavior dramatically, because people act according to the emotional atmosphere dominating their mind. Fear creates reactive behavior. Fearful people often panic quickly, overspend emotionally, avoid opportunities, think short-term, tolerate less discomfort, and unfortunately, modern society constantly feeds fear. Fear keeps people distracted, emotionally reactive, mentally exhausted. Ancient traditions understood something modern people forgot. The condition of the mind matters enormously. That's why the psalm became important, because it interrupted fear-based thinking repeatedly. According to old teachings, the psalm was not meant to be read casually once. It was spoken repeatedly, especially early in the morning, before sleep, during financial difficulty, during emotional confusion. Why? Because repetition strengthens emotional conditioning. The human mind absorbs repeated language gradually. Modern psychology now confirms something ancient people sense intuitively. Repeated thoughts influence self-image, emotional responses, confidence, behavior patterns. That affects real-life outcomes over time. Most people allow the external world to train their mind for them. News trains their fears. Social media trains comparison. Stress trains hopelessness. And eventually, their internal voice becomes negative automatically. Ancient wisdom traditions resisted this aggressively. They believed the mind required intentional direction. Otherwise, fear and chaos would dominate naturally. That's why sacred repetition existed. Words influence emotion. Emotion influences behavior. Behavior influences outcomes. That's the hidden chain most people ignore. People think language is harmless, but repeated language creates emotional atmosphere internally. A person constantly repeating hopeless thoughts behaves differently from someone repeatedly reinforcing stability and confidence. That's why this psalm was considered dangerous by some ancient storytellers, because mentally weak people become mentally stronger through repeated conditioning, and mentally stronger people behave differently in the world. There's another reason powerful teachings often disappear over time, because disciplined thinking creates independent people, and independent people think clearly, react less emotionally, tolerate fear better, make calmer decisions. That creates personal authority, which is dangerous to systems built on fear and dependency. Whether literal removal happened historically or not, the symbolic meaning remains powerful. People disconnected from intentional thinking become easier to control emotionally. The psalm repeatedly emphasized one hidden principle. Inner condition affects outer experience, not magically, behaviorally. Calm minds behave differently. Disciplined minds behave differently. Confident minds behave differently. That changes opportunities, communication, consistency, emotional control, financial behavior, and over time, those differences compound. Most people today are financially overwhelmed emotionally, not just economically. Emotionally, constant stress damages patience, clarity, discipline, long-term thinking. That creates instability. Ancient practices attempted to restore inner stability first, because stable minds create stronger decisions. But the deeper reason this psalm became feared had nothing to do with superstition. It was because the words inside it slowly changed how people saw themselves. And once a person changes internally, their behavior begins changing externally too. There is something ancient people understood that modern society often ignores. The human mind is programmable, not like a machine, but through repetition. Whatever a person hears repeatedly, feels repeatedly, and says repeatedly begins shaping their emotional reality over time. That's why the psalm was treated differently. It wasn't viewed as ordinary reading material. It was considered mental conditioning, because the words inside it were designed to interrupt fear. And fear was always considered one of the greatest destroyers of human potential. Fear changes how people think. When fear dominates the mind, patience weakens, impulsiveness increases, clarity decreases, emotional reactions intensify. That affects money directly. Fearful people often make rush decisions, panic during difficulty, overspend emotionally, avoid opportunities, think short-term. Over time, that creates unstable outcomes. Ancient teachers observed this carefully. That's why they focused heavily on emotional stability, because calm minds create better long-term behavior. Many people unknowingly curse themselves emotionally every day, not literally, psychologically. They repeat, "I'll never get ahead. Everything is hard. I'm always struggling. Nothing works for me. People like me never succeed." At first, those sentences feel harmless, but repeated thoughts become emotional patterns. And emotional patterns become identity. That identity quietly shapes behavior. Ancient recitation practices relied on repetition intentionally, because repetition reshapes internal atmosphere. The psalm was often spoken every morning, before sleep, during fear, during uncertainty, during financial pressure, not because repeating words magically printed money, but because a repeated emotional state created by the words changed the person gradually. That's the hidden mechanism most people overlook. One reason this psalm was considered unusual was its emotional tone. It did not speak from desperation. It spoke from certainty, expectation, trust, confidence. That matters psychologically, because desperate minds behave differently from confident minds. Desperate people rush decisions, seek quick fixes, panic easily, tolerate less uncertainty. But emotionally grounded people behave more intentionally. That creates different outcomes over time. Most people never stop to notice how much negativity enters their mind daily. Fear-based headlines, stress, comparison, financial anxiety, emotional overload, and unfortunately, the brain adapts to repeated emotional environments. That means fear eventually becomes normal internally. When fear becomes normal, people unconsciously build their life around limitation. That's why ancient traditions guarded the mind aggressively, because internal atmosphere affects external behavior. Every human being has an internal voice constantly speaking. The question is, what is it saying repeatedly? Because repeated internal language becomes emotionally influential over time. A person constantly repeating, "I'm becoming disciplined," behaves differently from someone repeating, "I'll always fail." That affects confidence, resilience, consistency, emotional control, financial discipline. That's why the psalm mattered. It introduced different internal language repeatedly. Most people think identity is fixed, but identity is often reinforced through repetition. Repeated belief strengthens self-perception, and self-perception influences action. Someone who sees themselves as hopeless, unlucky, powerless, usually behaves differently from someone who sees themselves as disciplined, capable, intentional, emotionally grounded. That's why ancient practices focus so heavily on mental reinforcement, because repeated identity shapes repeated behavior. There's another reason these practices became rare. Silence exposes internal condition. Without distraction, people notice fear, anxiety, emotional exhaustion, hopelessness, inner chaos. And many people avoid stillness because they don't want to confront what's inside, so they stay distracted constantly. But distraction does not remove inner disorder. It only hides it temporarily. The psalm interrupted distraction. It forced intentional focus. This may surprise many people. Financial stability is often emotional before it becomes numerical. Emotionally unstable people struggle with impulsiveness, consistency, patience, long-term planning. But emotionally grounded people usually protect stability better. That's why ancient teachings emphasize inner peace repeatedly, not because peace magically attracts money, but because peaceful minds behave differently. Expectation changes behavior quietly. Someone expecting failure often hesitates more. Someone expecting improvement behaves more confidently. That confidence affects communication, opportunities, consistency, risk tolerance, resilience. The psalm repeatedly reinforced expectation instead of fear. That's psychologically powerful, because emotionally repeated expectation influences subconscious behavior over time. Many people repeat the same fearful emotional patterns for decades. Same thoughts, same reactions, same hopeless internal dialogue. Then wonder why external patterns rarely change. Because internal conditioning influences external behavior continuously. The psalm was designed to interrupt that conditioning. That's why it became emotionally powerful. People practicing intentional recitation often describe subtle changes first, not miracles, internal shifts. They become calmer, more hopeful, less reactive, emotionally stronger, mentally clearer, and eventually, those internal changes affect external behavior too, because behavior follows emotional condition. The real danger of the psalm was not mystical power. It was psychological transformation, because people who stop living in fear become harder to control emotionally. They think independently, act intentionally, remain calmer under pressure, and that changes how they move through life completely. But there was something even deeper hidden inside the psalm. It wasn't only changing thoughts. It was changing emotional identity itself. And once identity changes, life rarely remains the same. There comes a moment when repeated words stop feeling like words and start becoming identity. That's what ancient traditions understood deeply, because human beings eventually adapt to whatever emotional atmosphere they repeat consistently. Fear repeated long enough becomes personality. Hopelessness repeated long enough becomes expectation. Stress repeated long enough becomes normal. But the opposite is also true. Repeated confidence changes posture. Repeated discipline changes behavior. Repeated intentional thinking changes emotional stability. That's why the psalm was considered powerful. It was slowly reshaping the identity of the person speaking it. Most people try to change behavior without changing identity. But behavior usually follows self-perception. A person who secretly believes, "I'm weak, I always fail, nothing works for me," will often behave according to those beliefs unconsciously. not because they want failure, but because identity influences action quietly. That's why repeated sacred language mattered historically. It reinforced a different emotional identity over time. Ancient thinkers often believed the worst form of poverty begins internally first, not lack of money, lack of belief. Because once a person becomes emotionally defeated internally, their behavior changes dramatically. They stop trying consistently, taking opportunities, believing improvement is possible, tolerating discomfort long enough to grow. That internal collapse eventually affects external life too, which is why emotional conditioning mattered so much. Fear shrinks people psychologically. Fear makes people hesitate more, doubt themselves more, react emotionally, avoid risk, settle for less. Over time, fear trains people into smaller versions of themselves. That affects opportunities, finances, relationships, communication, discipline, because emotionally restricted people behave differently in the world. The psalm interrupted fear repeatedly. One of the unusual things about the psalm was its emotional certainty. It did not sound timid. It spoke with confidence. Stability will come. Protection exists. Flourishing is possible. Fear does not rule forever. That emotional tone matters psychologically, because certainty creates different emotional energy than desperation. And emotional energy affects behavior. A person consumed by hopelessness behaves differently from someone internally strengthening confidence daily. Modern society overloads the nervous system constantly. People rarely experience true stillness anymore. Noise, notifications, fear-based media, comparison, financial stress, overstimulation, and eventually, the mind becomes emotionally exhausted. Exhausted minds struggle with patience, focus, discipline, wise decision-making. That creates instability. Ancient practices attempted to restore emotional order internally first. Highly disciplined people throughout history often protected what entered their mind carefully, because they understood repeated exposure creates repeated emotional states, and repeated emotional states shape identity over time. That's why ancient recitation practices existed, not for empty ritual, for conditioning. The psalm became a daily emotional atmosphere. An atmosphere changes people slowly. Financial stability often requires emotional strength, the ability to delay gratification, tolerate uncertainty, stay calm under pressure, remain disciplined consistently. Fear weakens all those things, but emotional grounding strengthens them. That's why inner condition affects financial life indirectly but powerfully. People who feel emotionally stronger usually think more clearly, react less impulsively, remain more patient, recover from setbacks faster. That changes outcomes over time because they repeat the same emotional conditioning every day. Same fears, same internal language, same hopelessness, same reactive thinking, repeated endlessly, and eventually, the mind accepts limitation as identity. That's dangerous, because identity becomes self-fulfilling behavior. The psalm interrupted that cycle. It introduced a different emotional reality repeatedly. Hope changes behavior quietly, not fantasy, not denial. Hope, the belief that improvement is still possible. Hopeless people stop moving forward internally, but hopeful people persist longer, notice opportunities more carefully, recover faster emotionally, tolerate discomfort better. That changes financial behavior too, because success often belongs to people emotionally capable of enduring difficulty without collapsing internally. The subconscious mind absorbs repeated emotional messages gradually. That's why advertising works. That's why propaganda works. That's why negative self-talk works. And that's why intentional repetition works too. Ancient traditions understood what dominates the mind repeatedly eventually influences reality behaviorally. That's the hidden mechanism behind the psalm. The real power of the psalm was never supernatural fear. It was personal transformation, because emotionally strong people become harder to manipulate. They think independently, remain calmer, tolerate pressure better, avoid emotional panic, act intentionally. That changes how they move through life completely. after repeated recitation. Many people describe feeling something they had lost long ago, inner authority, the feeling that fear no longer controlled every decision. That changes posture, communication, confidence, behavior, opportunities, because people respond differently to emotionally grounded individuals. And emotionally grounded individuals make different choices too. The Saul was never only about wealth. It was about restoring alignment internally. Because once the mind stops drowning in fear constantly, clarity returns, discipline strengthens, behavior improves, and eventually, life changes externally too. But after repeating the psalm long enough, people realized the greatest miracle was not money itself. It was becoming mentally stronger than fear. And once that happened, everything else began shifting naturally. After repeating the psalm long enough, something unexpected began happening. People stopped reacting to life the same way. The fear that once controlled them weakened. The hopelessness became quieter. The emotional chaos lost its grip slowly. And once that happened, their decisions began changing too. That was the real transformation. Not magic, not superstition, inner reconditioning. Because, eventually, a person behaves according to the emotional state dominating their mind. Most people wait for external proof before changing internally. But ancient traditions believe the opposite. They believed inner condition must shift first, because the internal world affects behavior, confidence, discipline, emotional reactions, long-term thinking. And those things shape external reality gradually. That's why repeated recitation mattered. The psalm was creating a new emotional atmosphere internally. An atmosphere changes behavior. It's not always lack of opportunity. Sometimes it's chronic fear, fear of failure, fear of judgment, fear of loss, fear of uncertainty. Fear causes people to hesitate, procrastinate, avoid action, react emotionally, seek comfort over discipline. That quietly destroys long-term growth. Because disciplined lives require emotional stability. And emotional stability weakens when fear dominates constantly. The psalm repeatedly reinforced ideas modern fearful thinking often rejects. Ideas like stability is possible, abundance can grow, discipline matters, fear does not own the future, inner peace creates strength. Those ideas sound simple, but repeated consistently, they reshape emotional identity. That's powerful psychologically. Because identity affects every major decision a person makes. Not magically, behaviorally. Repeated thoughts shape emotional expectation. Expectation shapes behavior. Behavior shapes outcomes. A person constantly expecting defeat behaves differently from someone internally strengthening confidence daily. That changes. Opportunities noticed. Risks taken. Emotional resilience. Consistency. Communication. Discipline. Everything changes gradually. That's why ancient people guarded thought patterns carefully, because repeated inner language eventually becomes outward behavior. Many people today wake up immediately consuming stress, bad news, comparison, fear-based media, emotional noise, then repeat the cycle daily. Eventually, their nervous system remains overloaded constantly, and overloaded people struggle with clarity, patience, intentional thinking, long-term discipline. That creates emotional instability. Ancient practices attempted to interrupt this psychological chaos. The psalm became a daily mental reset. Emotionally strong people are not people without problems. They are people not ruled completely by fear. That changes everything, because emotionally grounded people remain calmer under pressure, make fewer impulsive decisions, think longer term, tolerate uncertainty better, stay disciplined longer. Those traits create stability gradually. Financially, too, because wealth often requires emotional consistency more than emotional intensity. One of the deepest transformations people described was this. They began trusting themselves again, not arrogantly, quietly, because repeated intentional practice rebuilt confidence, awareness, emotional control, inner stability, and once self-trust returns, discipline becomes easier. People who trust themselves follow through more often, recover faster from mistakes, stay intentional longer, stop collapsing emotionally during difficulty. That changes outcomes powerfully over time, because most people never interrupt their conditioning. They repeat fear, distraction, emotional overload, hopelessness, daily, for years, then wonder why their life feels emotionally heavy constantly, because the mind becomes shaped by repeated atmosphere. The psalm interrupted that atmosphere intentionally. It introduced peace, expectation, stability, confidence, emotional grounding, repeated consistently. Ancient wisdom often viewed wealth differently from modern society. Not only money, but clarity, discipline, peace, emotional strength, self-control, stability, because money without inner stability often disappears quickly. But disciplined minds protect what they build. That's why the psalm focused on inner alignment first. So was the psalm really removed because it was too powerful? Maybe literally, maybe symbolically. But the deeper truth remains important either way. Powerful ideas change people. And once people change internally, their behavior changes externally too. That's what made the psalm dangerous to fear-based thinking. It reminded people that the mind does not have to remain trapped permanently, that emotional patterns can change, that identity can change, that behavior can change. And once behavior changes, life begins changing too. So, tonight, pay attention carefully to the words you repeat internally, because every repeated sentence becomes emotional conditioning eventually. If your inner voice constantly speaks fear, fear will shape behavior. But if your mind begins repeating discipline, peace, intentionality, confidence, stability, your behavior slowly changes too. And behavior quietly shapes destiny over time. Ancient people believed the greatest battles were first won inside the mind, because the words repeated in silence eventually become the life a person lives. If this message changed the way you think about the mind, fear, and wealth, then subscribe to Ancient Wealth Secrets for more forgotten teachings, powerful psychological insights, timeless wisdom, and hidden truths most people never hear anymore. And comment below, words shape destiny, because the thoughts repeated in silence eventually become the life you live.